Two rifles on a table, one on the left, wooden stock, wooden handguard, wooden pistol grip, the color of a coffee table from 1949. Overall length 880 millimeters, barrel 415, chambered for a cartridge measuring 7.62 by 39 millimeters, and it eats it out of a curved steel magazine that holds 30 rounds. That is the rifle a Soviet conscript was handed the year the Red Army wrote it into its armament tables. Now the one on the right, same three letters stamped on it, black polymer stock that folds, rail down the top of the receiver cover, rail under the handguard, optic clamped to the rail, chambered for a cartridge 2 millimeters narrower and a great deal faster. 76 years between the two of them, and everybody calls both of them the same thing. Here is what is strange. The rifle on the left is officially out of production in the country that built it, has been for years. The rifle on the right is called by a different number entirely inside the Russian army, and it is what a Russian infantryman actually carries in 2023. Two rifles, one name. That is the problem. Hold on to 1949, because that is where this turns, and it does not turn the way you have been told. I'm Brett Callahan. I went and read the whole file on the Kalashnikov, and it does not say what the documentaries have been telling you it says. It never has. Sit down for this one. You have heard the version 100 times. A Russian tank mechanic in a hospital bed sketches a rifle, hands it to the Red Army, and 40 years later, half the planet is carrying it. Simple weapon, simple story, simple man. That is the film version. That is the museum placard version. And every single piece of it collapses the moment you touch the actual paperwork. 1949. Write it down. The year the Red Army wrote a rifle into its armament tables without a model designation on the paperwork, without a year attached to it, and without saying out loud which of the competing designs had actually won the trials. That is where this turns. I am not going to tell you what turns on it yet. I am going to earn it. So here is where we are going. First stop, the problem the rifle was built to solve, because it is not the problem you think it was. Second, the rifle itself, laid out against what it replaced. Third, what happened when it hit real infantry. And fourth, the decision that quietly ended the original and started the one on the right. The requirement was signed on the 15th of July, 1943, middle of the war. The Red Army had just fought its way through Stalingrad with two weapons that were not talking to each other. On one shoulder, a bolt-action rifle that could reach out to 800 meters but fired one round at a time. On the other shoulder, a submachine gun that could empty a magazine in 2 seconds but could not hit a man reliably past 100 meters. In between those two, there was nothing. The order that came down demanded a self-loading and automatic rifle chambered for a brand new intermediate cartridge, something that would replace both. It gave Soviet designers roughly 4 years to produce it. The problem landed on a 24-year-old tank sergeant named Mikhail Kalashnikov. He had been wounded outside Bryansk in October 41, spent the recovery period reading small arms manuals, and by 1942 he was submitting prototype submachine guns to a small arms testing range outside Moscow. The intermediate cartridge his rifle would eventually chamber went through its own revision. Introduced in 1943 at 7.62 by 41 millimeters, redesigned in 1948 to 7.62 by 39. Kalashnikov's accepted design was completed in 1947, and the Red Army wrote it into its armament tables in 1949. Two dates, 2 years apart, and both of them matter. Here's what the requirement forbade. It forbade tight tolerances. It forbade any design that assumed a soldier would clean his rifle every night. It forbade any mechanism that would stop working in mud, in freezing rain, in Central Asian dust that gets into everything you own. And it forbade complicated machining, because Soviet industry in 1943 could not produce a precision machined rifle at the scale the war demanded. What the requirement forced was the exact opposite of what a Western armorer would call a good rifle. Loose parts, heavy parts, a weapon a conscript could learn in an afternoon and a factory could stamp out by the 100,000. Now stop for a second, because up until now, this is the story you have heard before. Man gets wounded, man designs rifle, rifle gets adopted. That is the biography. What we are actually doing from here on is different. We are going to look at what the paperwork actually decided, and who decided it, and on what evidence, and where the story you have been told stops matching the story in the file. If you have an opinion by the end of it about whether the rifle on the left and the rifle on the right are actually the same weapon, Tell me in the comments before you hear my answer. I want to know where you land before I tell you where I landed. And remember 1949. It is coming back. Start with the cartridge, because everything else falls out of it. 7.62 by 39 millimeters. Intermediate, meaning between a rifle round and a pistol round, in power and in size. The Soviet carbine that already existed at that time, the SKS, fired the same cartridge from a fixed 10-round magazine and a semi-automatic action. Same round, different rifle, and that is the whole point. One cartridge, two weapons, one supply chain. That is not a small decision. That is an army committing itself. The Western equivalent that would come along 15 years later fired a smaller, faster round, 5.56 by 45, from a rifle almost 100 millimeters longer. Two different philosophies about what infantry fire is for, and they collide in Vietnam, but that is the next chapter. Now the magazine. 30 rounds. Detachable. Curved because the cartridge is tapered and a straight magazine would not feed reliably. That number, 30, is the number every service rifle on the planet ended up copying, and the reason is arithmetic. The SKS it replaced held 10 in a fixed magazine that had to be reloaded from stripper clips. That means one Kalashnikov equals 3 SKS reloads worth of continuous fire. Every second a man is not reloading is a second he is shooting at the guy across the field. That is the calculation. Higher magazine capacity forced Soviet doctrine to rewrite itself around sustained squad-level automatic fire, and every rifle since has been arguing with that decision or agreeing with it. To picture the size of it, put it next to what it replaced on the Soviet rack. The Mosin Nagant bolt action was 1,230 millimeters long. The Kalashnikov is 880. That is a rifle 350 millimeters shorter, a foot and a bit, being handed to a soldier who is now expected to shoot it faster, from more positions, in more terrain. You do not appreciate that difference until you have tried to swing a Mosin around inside a farmhouse doorway. The Kalashnikov swings. The mechanism is where the simplicity gets misunderstood. Gas-operated, gas from the fired cartridge cycles the action. Long-stroke piston, one solid part, moving as one piece. Rotating bolt, two lugs turned to lock into the barrel. Selective fire, one lever, 3 positions. Safe, full auto, semi-auto, in that order, and that order is deliberate because a cold hand finds full auto first. Stamped or milled receiver, the box that holds it all. The loose clearances everybody quotes are real, and they are the reason a rifle full of sand still fires. It is not that the rifle is simple, it is that the rifle is forgiving. That is the version everybody already has. The specs, the mechanism, the story about the tank sergeant. Here is what happens next, and it is not in the version. The rifle goes to the trials range in 1946, comes out in 1947, gets written into the armament tables in 1949, and inside 12 years the Soviet Ministry of Defense quietly decides it is not good enough. Stay with me. The trials ran from 1946 into 1947 at a small arms testing range outside Moscow. Standard Soviet protocol. Endurance firing to a specified round count. Drop tests, mud immersion, dust chamber, freezing tests because half of the country is frozen half of the year. Kalashnikov's design was going up against 2 other named prototype designs, both of them from more experienced engineers with more prototypes behind them. What the trials measured was not accuracy in the target shooter sense, it was stoppages per 1,000 rounds, ease of disassembly with cold fingers, the number of parts a private could lose and still get the rifle back together. The exact stoppage numbers are in the trial's paperwork, and the paperwork is not on public shelves, but the ranking is not disputed. Kalashnikov won on reliability, he lost on group size, and the board went with reliability. Now think about what that rifle is actually doing in a pair of hands. It weighs a little over 4 kilograms loaded, almost 9 pounds. The action cycles with a heavy mechanical clack you can hear across a room. Every round, the piston slams back, the bolt turns, and a spent case flies out to the right. The recoil of a 7.62 round is not vicious, but it is present, and full auto walks the muzzle upward inside a burst of 3 or 4 rounds. The safety lever is on the right side of the receiver, and it is stiff and it is loud. In freezing weather, with gloves, you learn to slap it down with the side of your hand. A trigger a cold hand cannot find is not a trigger. A safety a cold hand cannot move is not a safety. 1949. There it is again. The board that had put the rifle through its trials wrote it into the Red Army armament tables under a designation that carried no year and no model number, just 3 letters and a cartridge. 7.62 Automatic Kalashnikov. That is unusual. Every other Soviet weapon of that period got a model year attached to it. This one did not. The paperwork's silence on the year is not an accident. It reads as an institution that had not fully decided which version of the rifle it had actually bought. Milled receivers were already showing manufacturing problems. Stamped receivers were being tried and failing. The board accepted the rifle before its own factories could reliably make it, and the paperwork covered the gap by leaving out the year. Now the counter case. Not everybody who has read the same file agrees with that reading. The counter-argument runs like this. The Red Army adopted plenty of weapons without model year designations, particularly in the immediate post-war period when nomenclature was chaotic, and reading concealment into a missing date is reading too much into paperwork clutter. That argument carries weight. There are at least 3 other Soviet small arms adoptions from that same window with the same nomenclature quirk. But the missing year is not the flaw. The flaw is what the rifle itself could not do. And the flaw is measured, and the flaw is what forced the decision that ended the original and started everything you see on the right side of that table. That decision came down 12 years later. The flaw was weight and it was cost. A milled receiver Kalashnikov weighed a little over 4 kilograms loaded and required a solid block of steel to be machined down into a receiver. Hours of skilled labor per rifle in a country that did not have that many skilled machinists to spare. The Red Army was projecting a rifle in the hands of every infantryman in every socialist republic and every Allied army, and the arithmetic on milled receivers did not close. 4 kilograms was the weight the doctrine could accept. The Western rifle being fielded around the same time weighed 3. That 1 kilogram gap does not sound like much until you multiply it by a soldier walking 18 kilometers a day for a week. Then it is the whole world. So here's the decision, and here's the part they never taught you in school. In the late 1950s, roughly 1959, the Soviet Ministry of Defense quietly signed off on a redesigned Kalashnikov. Stamped sheet metal receiver, lighter barrel profile, modified stock angle, new muzzle device. Roughly 600 grams lighter, cheaper to build by a factor the ledgers do not agree on, but which is substantial. The decision was signed under a new designation, 3 letters plus 1, and every rifle that had come off the line before it was, on paper, a different weapon. Not officially declared obsolete, not officially replaced, just superseded, and quietly walked off the production lines while the new one walked on. The rifle everybody in the world was about to spend 40 years calling by the original 3 letters was, inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense, already a legacy weapon by 1960. The ministry never announced it. There was no public reversal, no press release, no acknowledgement that the rifle written into the armament tables in 1949 had been quietly walked off the factory floor 11 years later. The record is silent on why. Foreign observers did not distinguish between the 2 rifles for years. The silhouettes are nearly identical at any distance beyond arm's reach, and the receiver stamping is invisible in photographs. The Soviet states simply acted, without comment, and the rifle the West kept photographing in the hands of Vietnamese and African and Latin American fighters through the 60s and 70s was, in most cases, already the second version. The constraint the decision was solving was industrial. A Soviet factory in 1959 could not produce milled receivers fast enough to arm every conscript, every ally, and every insurgency the state wanted to arm. Stamped receivers changed the arithmetic. A stamped receiver comes off a press in seconds. A milled receiver takes hours. Multiply that difference across a projected production run of tens of millions, across Allied factories in 6 countries, and the milled version becomes impossible on the timeline the state needed. The rifle did not evolve because it was flawed. It evolved because the factory could not keep up. And somebody had to carry that. Every infantryman in every socialist state from the 60s onward was carrying a rifle whose predecessor had been retired without ceremony inside a decade. The rifle on the left side of that table was already a museum piece before most of the men who ever fired one in anger had picked one up. Which brings us to what it did after that. From 1960 onward, the Kalashnikov pattern spread. It became the standard infantry weapon of 106 countries. It was built under license in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, China, North Korea, and Egypt, among others. It was copied without license in a dozen more. Estimates of total production run past 100 million rifles. Not 100,000, not a million, 100 million, of a rifle pattern that had, on paper, been superseded inside the country that invented it by 1960. The disconnect between the rifle the Soviet Ministry of Defense considered current and the rifle the rest of the world considered iconic runs the entire length of the Cold War, and it is why the three letters mean two different things to two different audiences. The Western answer arrived in stages. The American service rifle that entered mass issue in the mid-1960s was chambered in a smaller, faster cartridge, 5.56 by 45, and weighed roughly 3 kilograms empty. Nearly a kilogram lighter than a milled Kalashnikov. It was more accurate at range, it was less tolerant of dirt. Vietnam is where those two philosophies met at squad range, and both sides came home arguing about it. The Soviet response arrived in 1974 with a redesigned rifle in a new cartridge, 5.45 by 39, matching the Western logic about small, fast rounds. The rifle looked like a Kalashnikov, still carried the three letters, and was, mechanically, still one. What the Kalashnikov actually changed was not lethality, it was expectation. Before 1949, an infantry rifle was a precision instrument owned by a marksman. After 1949, an infantry rifle was a piece of industrial output that a conscript could learn in a day, drop in a river, and fire at a stranger before nightfall. That is what it changed. Every rifle designed since, Western, Eastern, Israeli, Chinese, everything, argues with that baseline, or accepts it. Doctrine rewrote itself. Squad tactics rewrote themselves. The idea that a country could arm every citizen with a reliable automatic weapon, cheaply, at scale, rewrote itself. The rifle did not win a war. It changed what a rifle was for. And now go back to that date, 1949, the year the paperwork went in without a model year attached to it. I told you at the top of this thing that it does not turn the way you have been told. What I have not told you yet is what the paperwork was actually covering up. And it is not what the enthusiasts say, and it is not what the documentaries say. It is a decision about who actually gets the credit for the rifle in the first place, and how that decision is held for 74 years and counting. Here is what a design bureau in the Soviet Union actually was. It was not one man, it was not two men, it was a room. Draftsmen at benches, engineers at drawing boards, a chief designer whose name goes on the top of the paperwork, and a rotating cast of specialist engineers who solve specific problems. The gas system, the trigger group, the safety mechanism, the magazine feed. Every one of those subsystems in a modern rifle is somebody's specific work, somebody's specific patent, somebody's specific engineering, somebody's specific hours at a drawing board arguing with a superior about tolerances. The name that goes on the rifle is the name of the man who signed the top of the paperwork. 1949. The rifle went into the Red Army armament tables under one name, Kalashnikov. The paperwork underneath it, the drawings, the subsystem specifications, the acceptance reports, carried multiple other names, and every one of those men has been effectively erased from the popular story of the rifle. The receiver design carries fingerprints of a designer named Vulcan, whose competing prototype the board rejected, but whose stamped receiver methodology the winning rifle absorbed. The gas piston in its long stroke arrangement borrows heavily from earlier Soviet self-loading rifle work. Kalashnikov signed the top of the paperwork. Kalashnikov gave the interviews. Kalashnikov received the Hero of Socialist Labor twice, and the men whose subsystems went into his rifle received the credit that fits on the back of an internal memo. That is what turns on 1949. Not a rifle, a signature. And it is why the version you have been told, the tank mechanic sketching a rifle in a hospital bed, single-handed, is not exactly a lie, but is exactly the same kind of story every state tells about every weapon it wants a national symbol out of. One man is easier to put on a stamp than a room full of engineers. The rifle on the left of that table has one name attached to it in the public memory. It has half a dozen names attached to it inside the paperwork, and only one of them ever became famous. The numbers don't agree on this one, and I'm going to tell you about it because that is the honest way to do it. How many Kalashnikov pattern rifles are there in the world right now? One count that gets quoted a lot puts it at 100 million. Another count, done by other people looking at the same production data with different assumptions about how many rifles the unlicensed factories in 6 countries actually produced, puts it at closer to 75 million. 25 million rifles between the two figures. That is not a rounding error. That is the entire American service rifle inventory missing. The disagreement itself tells you something. One count is counting rifles that came off known production lines. The other is trying to count rifles that came off lines nobody was tracking, clandestine factories, unlicensed copies, wartime workshops in countries the original licensor never authorized. Two different questions, two different answers, and neither is exactly wrong. That is where the file stops. Anybody who tells you they know the number to within 10 million is guessing, and anybody who tells you they know it to within 1 million is lying. There is a rifle in a glass case in a museum in central Russia. Wooden stock, milled receiver, 1949 acceptance stamp on the left side of the receiver in Cyrillic, and if you look at it long enough, you can see the tool marks where the machinist finished the receiver by hand. It is roped off. There is a placard next to it in 2 languages. The placard tells you who designed the rifle, when it was accepted, and what it is chambered for. The placard does not tell you that inside 11 years, the design bureau that produced it walked it off the factory floor without a public reversal. The placard does not tell you that the paperwork carries 5 other names underneath the one on the label. School groups walk past that case every day of the week. Not one of them, and not one of the teachers standing at the back of the group, has any idea what actually turned on 1949. They see the rifle, they see the label, they walk on. History's better than they made it sound. So look at those 2 rifles again. The one on the left and the one on the right. 2 answers to whether they are actually the same weapon, and both of them are defensible. Same 3 letters, same lineage, same designer's name on the paperwork. Different rifle. Which side of that counter do you land on? If there is a Kalashnikov pattern rifle in your family with a story attached to it, tell me what is stamped on the receiver. There is another rifle sitting in the same set of Soviet paperwork, and its story ends worse than this one does. That one is next. History's better than they made it sound. See you next time.